John Richardson and Linda Moore had been dating for the past 4 years. They had gotten married the moment they met. Both Linda and John knew after the very first date that they were meant to be together and knew they would be together forever. But Linda was studying at UCLA, a big deal for a woman in 1971, and she was determined to get her doctoral degree before she took any time off for wedding planning, honeymoons, and all of that. John didn't mind, though. He'd waited his 31 years on this earth for a woman like Linda, so it was a few more years anyway. She was his, and he was hers. A court document with their names on it didn't change that fact in the slightest. Besides, it was Linda's brains and her ambition that made him fall in love with her. The 70s wasn't exactly a progressive time, so the two couldn't live together without being married, or both their very religious families would be mortified at their indiscretions. So they settled for taking as many weekends away together as they could, mostly going camping, since they enjoyed the great outdoors a lot. Getting away from the busy life of university with a short trip to nature was always something they looked forward to each week. They always took a friend or two, sometimes one of their parents, but most of the time they took John's half-brother, George Waddell, his wife, and their 3 kids. John liked to teach his godchildren to fish, and Linda ran and played with them in the streams. George and his wife didn't mind the attention at all. The young couple obviously enjoyed the children, and he and his wife could finally take a breather between child-rearing and work schedules. On the weekend of July the 26th, the group of them headed off toward Grand Lake, Colorado, looking forward to 4 days of fun and nature at Holsworth Ranch, just a little ways away from the Rocky National Park. Linda and John only had a single-man tent each, so they set them up next to each other, and George had bought his camper van to accommodate his family of 5. In 2 weeks' time, Linda and John would be married, and they wouldn't have to sleep separately anymore, something that they were both looking forward to. They set up camp while Linda took the kids to explore, and when they got back to the tents, they were erected and the fishing poles were already out. George's oldest son, 10-year-old George Jr., was the lucky one that day. The boy caught enough fish for the entire family, so they fried them up in a pan over the open fire for dinner. The cooler with chops and hot dogs stood forgotten in the camper, with so much fresh fish right there in front of them. The children began to doze off next to the fireside as the grown-ups had a drink or two and chatted into the evening. When the littlest one began to snore, the adults bid everyone good night. Tomorrow was going to be a long day of hiking and more exploring. Everyone needed to have enough sleep for it. John kissed Linda goodnight, and they each retreated to their own tents while the Waddell family settled in their camper. But they'd left all of their plates, the pan, and the potato chip bag where they'd sat down for dinner, with plans to clean up the next morning before breakfast. And you probably know where this is going by now. All that food and the strong smell of cooked fish wafted into the forest, attracting every critter in the vicinity. Soon, a few field mice and even a raccoon got a taste of the scraps. As the night wore on and the little critters had their fill, another, bigger omnivore was making its way toward the scent. It took the 200-pound black bear all night to trek through the brush and to reach the camp just as the sun broke over the horizon. Everyone was still fast asleep, except for John. He sleepily stumbled out of his tent with the intention of emptying his bladder behind a crop of trees before heading back to bed to catch some more sleep. He walked down the very path that the hairy creature was approaching from, just 8 yards away from his tent flap. It's hard to say who was the most shocked. John, in his half-asleep state walking into a colossal, fully grown bear, or the animal who wasn't expecting to run into a human. But the reaction from both was instantaneous. The animal roared with shock and anger, pulling itself up to its hind legs, extending its full height. John turned and ran, but with his pants half undone, he barely made it a yard before his loose clothes tangled around his legs and he went sprawling into the forest floor. Before John had the chance to yell out to his fiancée and his friends, the animal was already on top of his back, clamping its teeth into the back of his head, neck, and back. Linda, who was closest to the scene, woke up in a panic and headed out before she even understood what she was hearing. To her horror, she stumbled into the worst event she'd ever witnessed in her life. John was in the bear's mouth, being lifted into the air by the back of his shirt, and blood was spewing everywhere, turning the animal's fur dark red. The fabric of his shirt ripped clean out of the bear's teeth, and he fell to the ground. Linda launched herself at them, screaming a primal cry as she went. She threw herself over the fiancé's lifeless body, shielding him from the raging bear. The beast grabbed her by the back, using both its teeth and its claws. They went through her nightshirt like they weren't even there, raking grooves an inch deep into her skin as they went. It lifted her off John and threw her aside to get back at its initial target. Linda was thrown several feet away, landing hard against the trunk of a tree, breaking 3 of her ribs. She was knocked out cold from the strike against the tree that expelled all of the air in her lungs. Suddenly, George came running at them, dressed only in his sleeping shorts. Like Linda, he hadn't stopped to consider the danger to himself. He spared only a second to yell for his wife to lock the door and arm herself before he set off to do what he had to do to save his baby brother and future sister-in-law. As he came at the bear, he passed the fireplace and grabbed the pan they'd left there the night before. Bits of fish and cold, clumpy oil flew through the air when he brandished it. The bear charged at George, swinging wildly. The pan clanged against the animal's paw just as it swiped at George, undoubtedly saving George's face from a severe mauling. The bear barely felt the pan strike it, but it did feel the fish bones and oil that went into its eyes. Clawing at its own face to get the fine shards of bone out of its eyes, it began to yowl in pain and run back into the forest from where it came. It passed Linda on its way out, where she was playing dead next to the tree. George headed toward John, while his wife, who'd locked their children in the camper van, went off to help Linda. Linda groaned in pain. The wounds on her back were seeping blood, but no longer flowing freely. She was alive, despite her broken ribs and the damage to her back. But John was another story altogether. Lying on his stomach, he wasn't moving, and George could see the horrendous damage done to the back of his neck even before he reached his brother. The back of John's neck had been torn out almost completely. His vertebrae were poking through the shreds of flesh, and George could see blood pouring out in tune with his heart. Within seconds of reaching his body, the blood torrent stopped. There was no more left to spill, and his heart stopped beating before George could even turn him over. He loaded his dead brother into the camper while his wife wrapped Linda's wounds as best she could. Together, they carried her inside, too. It took them 20 minutes to reach the ranch owner, where they called in for help. The children never moved from the bed where they were huddled together in fear. Their uncle and aunt were both torn and broken, in full view on the camper floor. There was no way to spare them from the sight, not if they were going to get Linda to help on time. Thankfully, Linda's injuries, as severe as they were not very deep. Doctors worried that there had been damage to her spine, but miraculously there was no lasting damage. Her broken ribs posed the biggest threat, given that they were practically shattered, and they feared that bone would find its way into her lungs. But even with that danger, Linda made a full recovery and was out of the hospital within the week. They held John's funeral on what would have been their 1-week wedding anniversary, with Linda still in a wheelchair next to his gravesite when they lowered him into the ground. Unfortunately, no one could locate the bear. Professional hunters and sniffer dogs spent 2 weeks scouring the area, but it was gone just as quickly as it had come. There were more attacks in the years after Richard's death, and not all of those bears were identified either. So it's possible his killer went on to bring even more unsuspecting campers to their terrifying final affliction. Michigan in the United States is famous for its fruits, shorelines, and its popular university campus. It holds the nation's longest freshwater coastline and has plenty of untouched nature spots that invites adults and children to explore and discover new areas. One thing that Michigan is distinctly not known for is bear attacks, boasting one of the lowest attack rates in the United States. There have only been 3 fatal bear attacks in the state of Michigan, which is surprising, given that there is an active population of approximately 12,000 black bears. These bears are considerably smaller and less aggressive than their brown cousins, meaning they are less likely to cause a conflict and will usually stay within their own territory. That being said, if someone were to enter their habitat, the bears wouldn't hesitate to catch an easy lunch. This was unfortunately the fate for young Carol Ann Pomranky. Carol Ann was born in 1945 and lived with her mother, father, and her older brother, Alan. She lived a simple life on a farmland in Michigan, where her father worked as a keeper of a fire observation tower in Marquette National Forest. One day, on July 8, 1948, 3-year-old Carol Ann was playing on the porch by herself while her mother and brother prepared the house inside. This was not an unusual occurrence. Whilst their father was away at work, the children would be left to do as they pleased. They knew the forest very well and had already been taught what to do in the case of a bear encounter. They were used to seeing bears moving around the yard, but one had never come close enough to cause any worry for the family. Carol Ann was left to play by herself as her mother's friend arrived to spend time with the family. At 2:30 p.m., Mrs. Vivian Pomranky and her friend Mrs. Summers sat in the kitchen together, chatting about their week. They were very close friends and regularly spent time together while their husbands worked away from home. While Carol Ann played outside, she had been told to stay close to the house, and the porch door was kept open so that the mothers could keep an eye on her. Alan had left the kitchen and was playing in the basement below, so they were finally given some time together to catch up and relax while the children were occupied. Suddenly, they heard a single short scream from the porch and knew something was wrong. They could tell that this wasn't just some playful shriek. The child was scared and had screamed out for her mother. They ran to the kitchen door and saw Carol Ann was on the porch. She was on her hands and knees, her hand reaching out to the porch door and looking up at her mother in fear of something that they couldn't see just yet. Vivian's blood ran cold when she saw what had scared her daughter so much, her eyes falling upon a large black bear as it made its way onto the porch behind her daughter. The bear had Carol Ann fixed in his sights and was growling, ready to grab the little girl. Vivian watched in horror as the bear grabbed her daughter by the legs and dragged her off the porch. Carol Ann screamed in pain and terror as she was dragged further and further away from her mother. Seeing this, and fearing the bear would try to enter the house next, Mrs. Summers pulled Vivian away from the door as she struggled to save her daughter and tried to shut the door. Carol Ann continued to scream and tried to get away from the animal, but the bear clamped onto the girl's skull with its jaws and her little body fell limp, killing her instantly as the teeth entered her brain. Mrs. Summers was finally able to shut the porch door, creating a final barrier between the women and the bear. But Vivian was determined to save her child, not knowing that she was already dead. She ran to the bedroom to find her husband's pistol, but in her panic she couldn't find it anywhere. She ran back downstairs and opened the door to confront the bear, but the garden was empty. She frantically searched for any sign of her daughter or the bear, but could only see the pool of blood on her porch, which gave no clue to the direction of the animal. Grief-stricken, she returned to her home and rang the ranger station to inform them of what had happened and begged them to save her daughter. Soon after the call, 7 rangers arrived at the Pomranky's cabin and waited at the edge of the forest. Ranger Bruce Elliott had returned home when he received the call to get his search dogs, hoping they would be useful in the search for Carol Ann. Once he arrived, the group was instructed to enter the forest, following the dogs as they went, and split into smaller groups to cover more ground. Almost immediately, one of the Labrador retrievers picked up a scent and led the rangers deeper into the woods in the hopes of saving the little girl. About 160 yards from the cabin, the men discovered blood spots along with a child's shoe and began to realize that they may be searching for a dead body rather than a living child, as they were told by Vivian. They continued to follow the dogs into the forest, and 150 feet into their journey, they found the body of Carol Ann Pomranky. It's one thing to find the body of an adult after a mauling, but it's a completely different situation when the victim is just a 3-year-old child. The group of rangers were distraught when they found Carol Ann facing upward and leaning against a tree. Had it not been for her horrifying injuries, the rangers would have thought she was sleeping. Her clothes were still partially intact. Her shirt was still covering her body, but slightly rolled up in the middle. Where the shirt had been pulled up, the evidence of her death became clear. The large cuts down her abdomen caused her intestines to spill out from her body and were attached to a nearby bush. Her legs had been fully eaten up to the knee, and there were deep gashes across her head and face. Despite the state of her body, there was little to no blood to be found around her, as if the bear had cleaned her up as he devoured her. As they stared at the child, they could make out the deep hole near her left eye, which appeared to be deep enough to reach her brain. The fatal blow. They knew there was nothing to be done, and a young life had been taken in such a brutal way. After some time, the men decided what they must do next. Some members of the group began walking back to the tower site and reported their discovery to their superiors, while another ranger was told to guard Carol Ann's body. The dogs seemed eager to continue into the forest, and so, hoping to find the bear responsible, the men continued forward. They tracked the scent of the bear, but it was difficult to keep a hold of, constantly disappearing and changing, which in return confused the dogs. Meanwhile, the man who had been left with the body, Wayne Weston, was waiting alone in the darkness. It was a horrible sight to be left with, a small child who was killed and desecrated in such a terrible way. He was thinking of all the small children around the area and how any of them could be next, when he heard the bushes rustling behind him. Suddenly, the bear burst through the leaves, rushing straight at Wayne Weston. He was prepared and withdrew his pistol, immediately firing 5 shots into the black bear, which killed it instantly. The other rangers quickly arrived back at the scene after hearing the shots and determined that the black bear had cached Carol Ann's body, ready to continue the feast. Satisfied that the bear was dead, they returned Carol Ann's body to her family, giving them the proper opportunity to grieve. They left them with the body and went back for the bear, wanting to make sure that the bear that they shot was truly the bear responsible for the child's death. Once they autopsied the bear's body, they were able to find human remains in its stomach, finally proving that the rampage of this animal was at an end. It was determined that the bear was suffering from starvation. Aside from Carol Ann's remains, there was nothing else present in its stomach, which suggested that the animal was just desperate at the time. Ultimately, the bear was purely just trying to survive and was able to get an easy meal, which unfortunately happened to be Carol Ann. Her story went on to other parents, showing them the worst-case scenario that could happen to their children, and it meant that all the children of Michigan had a safer eye upon them. Thankfully, Carol Ann Pomranky was the last fatality in Michigan by a black bear ever recorded. But this story just goes to show that the next time a black bear gets hungry, it wouldn't hesitate to bring someone else to their terrifying final affliction. Some might argue that there's never a good time to visit Siberia. For the majority of the year, the extreme snow, storms, and generally inhospitable conditions make for a pretty rough place to take a leisurely hike in. But July through August falls into Russia's summer months. Not that that means that it won't be cold. On a good summer day, the highest temperatures that you can expect only reaches about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Mornings are frosty, and nights are cold enough to require a few extra layers beneath your blankets. And the wildlife there is just as unforgiving as the weather. Wolves, brown bears, and snow leopards make up the larger predators. But don't forget about the giant moose and the smaller lynxes that are just as likely to kill a man if they happen to be cornered. Today's events take place in the southern end of Russia, in the Cyan Mountains in Irgaki National Park, right in the heart of the Siberian region. It's a popular hiking destination, but it's not one for the novice hiker. Just like the rest of Siberia, it's rugged, cold, and filled with more dangers than most people can handle. The group of 4 hikers traveled all the way from Moscow to make a 2-week trip out there in the wilderness. But these were no city slickers who were biting off more than they could chew. Yevgeny Starkov, Anton Shelkunov, Pavel Zemchukov, and another unnamed man all grew up in the countryside. They were seasoned hikers, hunters, and they knew how to rough it out in the wild. Each of them made their way to the city because of their jobs and met each other at a hikers club. The four became best friends, since most of the members of the club were either on the older side or merely young people interested in getting outside the city for the first time. Yevgeny was the oldest of all, at 42, and the rest were all in their mid to late 30s. The four had a map hung up in Yevgeny's apartment, dotted with pins at all the mountains and spots that they wanted to scale and explore. For the past 2 years, the men made it their project to visit every one of the locations that they'd pinned on that map of Russia. They wanted to climb the Cyan Mountains eventually, but for this first visit, they thought it was wiser to trek out the park from one end to the other to get the lay of the land and an idea of what the climate was like. Next year, this time around, they would attempt to scale the mountains. The first week went just as planned. They fit everything they needed into their packs and set off, camping at a different spot every night. On the 8th day, the men settled next to a hilltop that had a river running beside it for 2 days, veering away from their usual routine so that they could do some fishing and rest their legs after spending 8 days on their feet trekking over the rocky and rugged terrain. The men were doing everything they should have to deter animals from being lured to the smell of their food. But after the first evening, an animal already found the place where they'd buried their food scraps. Another had dug into the covered hole that served as their toilet, too. The entire wilderness seemed to be aware of them already, and they'd been there less than 24 hours. But since the scratches on the ground where the animal had dug looked like it was made by a small animal, and they'd only spotted 2 moose stopping for a drink of water, they weren't all that worried about anything more dangerous. But that was a big mistake. The smell of their fish cooking over the coals alerted a brown bear in the area. Even in the middle of summer, when there's more food than usual, every single animal in the Russian wilderness will never let an opportunity for food pass up, especially not one that was sick. Something was very wrong with this adult male brown bear. Its eyes were bloodshot, probably from a raging fever. It was foaming at the mouth, and it was unusually aggressive. Whether it was rabid or had a parasitic infection that entered the brain, as bears are known to be susceptible to, no one knows. On the second evening, the bear began to lumber through the trees, following the smell of cooked fish. All night it walked until it finally reached the camp just as day broke. The group had just finished breakfast and were about to get packed up. Anton and Pavel were rolling up the sleeping bags to put them back in their packs, while Yevgeny and the other man went to disassemble the first of the 2 tents. Just then, the massive hairy beast burst through the trees. Everyone stopped what they were doing, utterly bemused and caught off guard that they were suspended in a moment of dumbfounded shock. The bear took one look at the 4 humans and let out a deafening roar of fury, the foamed spit around its mouth flying out at the force of its breath, and then it charged straight at Yevgeny, who was closest to the tree line. Everyone scattered, all gunning for the rocky outcrop. Everyone knew that their only chance to make it out alive was to get to higher ground. They carried no weapons besides their utility knives, and that wouldn't do any good against this enormous specimen of bear. The bear gave an angry swipe at Yevgeny, knocking him off his feet and breaking his jaw instantly. The crack of his jaw snapping sounded through the forest like a gunshot. The bear left Yevgeny to chase the men that were running toward the hill. But with all of them heading in a different direction, it was confused about which one to focus on. It hesitated for a second, then turned back to Yevgeny, who was knocked out cold on the ground. It took Anton and the others only 3 minutes to make it to the top of the hill, and only then did they realize that Yevgeny wasn't with them. They peeked over the edge of the sharp rock down to the camp, and even from up there they could see the horror playing out underneath them, clear as day. The animal was tearing chunks of flesh out of their friend's abdomen. Even through all the blood, the flecks of white saliva were still sharply visible around the bear's mouth. For what seemed like forever, they could only stare and listen in absolute disgust and horror at the sounds of their friend being consumed right before their eyes. Pavel got to his senses first. Whispering words of comfort and sense, he kept the other two from going into a full panic. Even if Yevgeny was alive after that first swipe, he was certainly dead now. There was no question about that. The only mercy he had been spared was that he was unconscious when he died. The only chance they had to make it out against a possibly rabid bear was to escape while it was preoccupied with eating their friend. The hike to their scheduled stop was 9 hours of hiking away. They could make it before the day was out. Staying put wasn't an option. The weather was too unpredictable to wait a few days for help to arrive. Staff at the rest point were unlikely to call in for help for at least 48 hours after they missed their check-in. All of their supplies were down at the camp. They had no water, no food, and they weren't even wearing shoes. And if they were caught at night wearing only their light underclothing, they'd be dead from exposure for sure. There was just no other way. They took one last look over the outcrop. The bear had made himself comfortable, sitting on its rump, gnawing at Yevgeny's left leg, almost like it was taking its time to savor its meal. They began to walk. The sounds of bones cracking, flesh squelching, and the satisfied growls of a feasting bear fading away in the background. What should have been a 9 or 10-hour hike was completed in just 7 hours. They'd walked right through their socks, and their feet were bleeding by the time they got to the cabin. There, the older couple who manned the station were appalled at the state of them, and even more horrified when they heard what had happened. But the chances of retrieving Yevgeny was virtually zero. Not only had the bear had 7 hours to do what he wanted with the body, the weather was starting to turn bad. In typical Siberian fashion, an unexpected storm rolled in just as the trio were airlifted out of the area. The chopper just couldn't risk flying back into the rain and mountain winds that were drenching the area. When they did finally get to the camp, the bear was long gone, and it had taken Yevgeny with it. The rain had washed away all signs of a spoor to follow, but still they tried for 5 days before finally admitting defeat when the next storm came rolling in. Yevgeny was gone, and all that was left behind was a ruined tent and a map of Russia filled with plans that were never fulfilled. It was September 14th, 2018. Corey Chuban traveled from his home in Florida to the Teton Wilderness. This is a vast and rugged expanse of protected land located in the state of Wyoming, United States. It is situated within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and is part of the Bridger-Teton National Forest, covering an area of approximately 585,000 acres. It is one of the largest wilderness areas in the United States. Corey's chosen adventure was to go bow hunting for elk. The thrill of the hunt was enticing, tracking the animal, finding it, and then silently closing in for the perfect shot. Corey opted to hire a guide for his hunt with a company called Martin Outfitters. Hunting guide Mark Uptain was the best around. He knew the Teton Wilderness, and he knew the prime locations to bag a bull elk. Often trekking in on horseback, Martin Outfitters proposed to get the hunter out into the wild areas where the big game roam. The two men set off towards Terrace Mountain. The scenery was beautiful, breathtaking vistas all along the route. Hikers who follow the trails travel through meadows, aspen groves, and over boulders. The region offers some of the best flora and fauna around. There are plenty of warnings regarding bears in the area, and hikers are advised to carry bear spray with them. But Corey and Mark weren't planning on bumping into any bears. They were out looking for elk. Even so, they knew to always expect the unexpected and carried firearms and spray for protection, just in case. They had been tracking an elk for some time when they finally came across the animal. It stood proud and tall, its fur glistening in the afternoon sun. The two men crept closer. Mark held back, allowing his client to step forwards and take the shot. Corey raised his loaded bow. He exhaled as he released the bowstring. The arrow flew through the air. It struck the elk. It was a good shot. The elk was mortally wounded, but managed to dart off into the undergrowth in a last-ditch effort to escape its death. Mark and Corey followed it, but they lost the blood trail, and light was fading. They decided to head back to camp and pick up where they left off tomorrow. It was a shame that they couldn't complete the hunt, and not knowing where the animal had vanished to was frustrating. At first light, the pair set off once more. They returned to the site of the hunt and followed the trail left by the elk. It wasn't long before they found the dead animal, lying on its side on the ground. It had been untouched by predators. The carcass was pristine. The elk hadn't made it far from where Corey had shot it. The two men knelt down beside it, admiring its beauty, admiring the shot. They began to field dress it, removing its limbs, gutting it, and quartering it to make carrying the weight easier to handle. Mark began to cut off the elk's head, but they never finished field dressing it. The smell of fresh blood, the smell of the kill had traveled through the air. The two men were not alone. Out of nowhere, two bears rushed from the undergrowth, barreling downhill towards the two hunters. They were first seen in an all-out charge. No warning, no mock charge. The two grizzly bears had ambushed them from the high ground. The attack took the two hunters by surprise. They had been caught completely off guard. All they could do was yell at the bears in an attempt to scare them off, but it didn't work, and one bear leapt onto Mark. He let out a cry as he was pushed into the soil. He had bear spray in his hip holster, but hadn't had time to pull it out. The weight of the bear crushed him. It bit into his face and slashed his torso with its long, sharp claws. The other bear stood watching from a few feet away. It didn't join in the attack. It didn't lunge at Corey. Instead, it shifted uneasily on its feet. Corey knew he had to act fast. He ran to their packs, which were a few yards away. Inside Mark's was a pistol, a Glock. He pulled it out and pointed it at the bear, but he couldn't get the pistol to fire. He fumbled with the mechanism, but something was wrong. It wasn't his gun. He wasn't familiar with it. Why wasn't it firing? All the while, Mark was being bitten and sliced. He was being shaken and pummeled into the ground. He was trying to fight back, pushing the bear's dripping jowls away from his face, but the bear was strong and powerful. As Corey stepped closer, pointing the gun at the bear, he repeatedly pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. Then his heart leapt. The bear stopped its attack and looked up at him. In an instant, it lunged at Corey. It swiped at his feet and sent him crashing to the ground. Corey knew this was bad news. He tried to protect his head and the back of his neck. He tried to curl up into a ball and protect his body, but the bear was ferocious in its attack. It didn't let up. It swiped powerfully with its paws, slicing into Corey's flesh, cutting his skin and tearing his muscle. He could feel the pressure of each bite, the searing sensation of each slash of the claws, but adrenaline kept the pain at bay. Eventually, after a frenzied attack, Corey managed to wriggle free, and the bear turned its attention back to Mark. In the couple of seconds between the bear mauling Corey and turning back to Mark, Corey threw the gun to Mark and fled the scene, but the gun landed out of Mark's reach. Corey needed to get help. He needed to find a phone. He knew Mark wouldn't hold out much longer. He ran up the hill back to the horses. It was a grueling 400-yard sprint uphill to reach them. He glanced back over his shoulder to see Mark on his feet, trying to fight off the enormous brown bear. Corey had severe lacerations and puncture wounds to his legs, chest, and arms, but he managed to climb onto one of the horses and ride to the top of a high ridge. Once there, he was able to get a phone signal and call for help. A helicopter was dispatched to the remote location, and Corey was picked up and taken to St. John's Medical Center, where he received treatment for his injuries. The authorities couldn't locate Mark. As the night drew in, the search was called off. What happened to Mark in his final moments remains a mystery, but it seems he put up a hell of a fight. He was likely still alive when rescuers arrived for Corey 2 hours after his initial emergency call. They had simply failed to find the young family man who was likely still fighting for his life. It was an agonizing wait until the following morning for both rescuers and Corey. But as soon as dawn broke, the search for the hunting guide resumed. Mark's mauled body was found 50 yards from where the attack had taken place. He had managed to empty the contents of his bear spray canister at some point during the fight. The smell of the pepper spray was all over the area, and on the head of the bear, authorities eventually killed. It seems Mark had walked the 50 yards uphill himself, blood streaks running down his face, and no sign of a struggle or of him being dragged to his final resting place suggests he walked there himself. But the bears had pursued him and had killed the 37-year-old with severe bites to the back of his head. Wyoming wildlife managers set traps for the bears. They used the elk carcass as bait, and the young male cub was caught alive in the leg trap. He was euthanized by officials. Shortly later, the female bear charged the investigators aggressively and was shot dead at the scene. Although hindsight won't change the past, it does highlight the errors made in this attack and possible ways in which the attack could have been avoided. The two men carried with them bear deterrents, but through lack of knowledge and mistakes, they were not used effectively. The 10mm Glock was inspected by experts and was found to be in good working order. However, because Corey was unfamiliar with how to operate the firearm, it was not used during the attack. Corey didn't carry his bear spray on him. Instead, he had left it in his pack because he had found it cumbersome on his hip whilst riding the horse. The reasons for this bear attack are not certain. Bears usually attack for one of three reasons: defending their young, their food, or actively hunting. In Mark and Corey's case, the most likely explanation for the attack is that the bears wanted the elk carcass. They may not have laid claim to it yet, but they had been attracted by its scent and wanted it for themselves. The female bear probably wasn't defending her cub, as the two men hadn't taken her by surprise or posed any threat to the young bear. She was unlikely to be actively hunting the pair of hunters, as her attack was not a predatory one. Whatever the reason, Mark lost his life tragically young and left behind his wife and their 5 children. He was a loving family man and a well-liked member of the community who tragically met his terrifying final affliction. Richard White picked up an old camera at 15, and ever since then, he was hooked. Photography was his passion, and it's what drove him to learn how to rough it out in the wild. Before that camera, he'd never shown any inclination toward camping, hiking, or anything to do with nature. But that lens made the world come alive in a way that he'd never seen before. He never intended to make a living from it, but the passion kept him tethered, his mind healthy, and his mundane job at a pharmaceutical company bearable. As long as he could look forward to a camping trip planned on his calendar at all times, he was happy. Now at the age of 49, he'd long since graduated from going with hiking groups and camping with friends. He was happy enough to set out alone and disappear into the wilderness for a few days by himself. His wife and teenage daughter had gotten used to his absences every few months. Lucy, who was now 15, had started showing an interest in the lens too, and though she accompanied her father on short day trips around their home in San Diego, this trip wasn't one of those. Richard was going to Alaska's Denali National Park, and this 3-day expedition was a little too much for Lucy just yet. Not that Richard minded, he had a special place in his heart for Denali. He'd been there 3 times before, and to him, there was nothing quite like the silence and the beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. This was also his last chance to visit the place before the deep Alaskan winter set in, leaving snow so deep that sections of the park closes down completely. September and August were the best times to come anyway. The animals scurried about in a last attempt to store food for the long winter ahead, and to eat whatever greenery was left before the frozen wasteland took the last edible morsels away. Everything living was out and about. The bears, lynxes, bucks, squirrels, and everything, just waiting to be captured for eternity on Richard's memory card. Richard kissed his wife and daughter goodbye and set out for Denali. When he pulled in, he picked out a spot to erect his tent and loaded everything inside, his food, sleeping bags, and all. He wasn't planning on spending much time at the camp. The next 3 days he was going to be out taking pictures until the sun went down. The drive had been a long one, and he barely had enough time to get his tent set up before it got dark, but he still managed to take a few snaps of the sunset at least. The next morning, Richard wolfed down breakfast and set out with his camera around his neck and his backpack full of snacks and drinks. The morning began just as he'd planned. As the sun rose, the wilderness came alive. Both small and large animals came out in hopes of getting their paws on as much food as they could in a single day. By the time the afternoon came around, Richard settled next to a river beside a clump of willows for a bite to eat. Before long, a buck came out of the trees for a drink of water. Then the birds rose from the trees, and even a massive moose made an appearance. Richard knew that if he camped out here all day, he'd get more footage than most other places in the park. But he never expected to catch a glimpse of the majestic grizzly bear. To Richard's absolute delight, a half-ton male lumbered out of the thicket of willows. He headed straight for a clutch of berry bushes just 60 feet away from where Richard was sitting, and began to pick them off with a surprising amount of finesse for such a large animal. As it picked the bush clean, Richard snapped one picture after the other, and he just couldn't believe his luck. The animal was now only 40 feet away, and still blissfully unaware of Richard's presence. Richard assumed that it saw him the moment it came out of the trees, but that it was choosing to ignore him, sitting so still in the distance. He'd run across bears from time to time, and they'd always preferred to keep their distance all on their own. But when this specimen of a bear came into the 40-yard range, Richard became a little unnerved. He'd never been so close to a bear before, and he doubted that it would come so close to him voluntarily. But now Richard was stuck where he was. He didn't want to move and startle the creature, fearing that could set off an unprovoked attack. So he remained where he was, continuing to take pictures and hoping that it would venture off on its own when the bushes were finally cleared of food. Richard was right to be worried about the small distance between them. He made a slight adjustment to get his legs in a more comfortable position and accidentally crushed a cereal bar wrapper beneath his foot. The sound made the bear look up, just as Richard snapped a shot of it looking straight into the camera. It saw Richard and tentatively moved toward the strange creature that was so close. Another picture, this time only 35 yards away, and another at 30 yards. Then Richard's blood ran cold. It wasn't coming in to investigate anymore. The bear was now running straight at him. He dropped his camera, left his bag, and began to sprint toward the water. It was the only place to go. There was no outrunning the pounding paws behind his back. At least in the water, Richard might be able to swim faster than the bear. The sound of the bear's pounding paws behind him was now accompanied by the deep huffing of the massive animal's lungs. It was closing in. Richard pumped his legs harder than he thought was possible. He didn't take the time to look back. He knew it was nearly on top of him. The pounding and the breathing was now accompanied by an earth-shattering growl, and then his legs folded beneath him as half a ton of pure murderous rage descended on top of him. It was only then that Richard uttered his first scream. At the exact same time, the bear's enormous claws ripped through his jacket. The grizzly began tearing at his flesh and raking him across the ground in a full-blown attack. The birds took flight from the reeds as Richard's screams punctured the air. No longer satisfied with clawing at the man's back, the animal picked Richard up and threw him over, spinning him through the air. Richard's torn-up back hit the dirt. Before he could even comprehend what to do in this life-threatening situation, the bear was on top of him again. This time, a set of nails grabbed his head, tearing through his scalp and cheek, and its jaws clamped down on his neck and shoulder. Richard's neck broke almost instantly. He had a quick flash of the most blinding pain he'd ever experienced in his life before the world went suddenly dark and Richard was no more. In a lot of ways, Richard was lucky. At least his death was relatively quick, and he wasn't aware of the next 15 minutes of hell his body went through. The grizzly continued to shake and tear at Richard's body. It ripped off his jacket and shirt, slashed at his abdomen, and almost entirely tore his scalp away from his skull. When the bear had finally expended all of its energy, it dragged Richard to a cache just 200 yards away, leaving a trail of insides that spilled out of Richard's torn abdomen. There, it buried him beneath the rest of the food it planned on eating over the next few days. Only 2 hours later, a group of hikers came upon Richard's discarded backpack, camera, shreds of clothes, and enough blood and gore to make the scene look like something out of a slasher movie. They ran 3 miles to the nearest station, and helicopters and rangers were deployed before the sun even began to go down. They only had to follow the bloody trail a short distance to find Richard's remains. But the bear guarding it posed a serious problem. It ran off into the woods when they approached, but darkening skies made visibility almost zero, and the shots that were fired all missed. So they returned the next day. From the air, they could identify 5 separate bears, but it was the one who kept coming back to the cache wanting to attack them that was deemed the culprit. It took 3 shots to down the 600-pound full-grown grizzly. The necropsy quickly determined that he was indeed the animal who had been feeding on Richard. But it was the camera that held the most chilling details. Though never released to the public, the officers described it as 5 final photographs of the animal becoming aware of its watcher, and for those 5 frames, looking dead straight into the lens of the camera, it came closer and closer and closer, capturing the few seconds before Richard White met his terrifying final affliction. Michio Hoshino was born in 1952 in Ichikawa, Japan. As a teenager, he developed a passion and enthusiasm for wildlife photography. He was particularly eager to spend time in Alaska, having bought a photography book in which the village of Shishmaref was photographed. At the age of 19, he wrote to the village's mayor and received a reply 6 months later inviting him to visit. From that moment on, his career as a nature photographer was set, and he became one of the most accomplished photographers of his era, often being likened to the world-famous Ansel Adams. But tragically, his love for wildlife photography and the career path his skill and flair had paved for him led to a fearsome encounter that shook his family, friends, and colleagues. As a boy, Michio loved exploring the wilds of Japan. He was an adventurous individual who was captivated by the natural world around him, but also an avid reader of a range of different book genres. His love for storytelling and, ultimately, writing was a big part of his career as a wildlife photographer. At the age of 16, he traveled solo across North America. He visited all the big cities and the wonders of the likes of the Grand Canyon. When he returned to Japan, he attended Keio University, graduating in 1976 with a major in economics. It was during his time there that he came across the grainy photo of Shishmaref that sparked his interest in Alaska. He wanted to know how the tiny community survived in such a bleak and inhospitable environment. He had so many questions, which is why he penned a letter and simply addressed it to Mayor Shishmaref, Alaska. During one of his university summers, he spent 3 months in the Eskimo village, living with a family and getting stuck into their way of life there. He returned to the state to study wildlife biology at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. He had secured some work experience with a professional photographer and put his own photography skills to the test. He would venture off to the remote Alaskan wilderness in pursuit of the perfect shots. He documented his ventures in numerous essays. He had a unique ability to bring his storytelling to life, and through it and his photos, he brought the natural world of Alaska to people in all corners of the planet. His work soon earned him prestigious awards, and it was showcased all over the world. But his final photo, or at least what was believed to be his final photo, became one of his most famous yet. It was August 1996, and Michio had been assigned to work on the filming of a documentary about brown bears. He left his wife, Naoko, and his son, Shoma, in Alaska and set off for Russia. At that time, he and Naoko had been married for 3 years. The destination for Michio and the television production crew was Kurovskoye Lake, situated on the Kamchatka Peninsula, situated in the Russian Far East. The lake is a crater lake formed from the explosion or collapse of a volcano. It is surrounded by bush and trees, mostly alder, pine, and stone birch. Back in 1996, the lake, which is a nature reserve, was thought to have the highest population of brown bears in Kamchatka and possibly even Russia. This was precisely why Michio and his team were headed there. They were guaranteed exceptional viewing of bear activity. The documentary they planned on filming was for a Japanese television station. The team's field guide, Igor Ravenko, who was a local expert, took the team to a known bear haunt. Rumor has it the guide knew of a bear that was unafraid of humans. It continued to fish in the crystal clear waters as people approached it. This was a photographer's dream. The team were able to capture unique and up-close footage of the animal as it continued to behave in its natural way, just feet from the cameras. But 2 days later, Igor, the guide, spotted some disturbing signs around their camp. Bear scat and markings were visible in and around it. When the team had been out in the wilderness, the bear had investigated their campsite. A chill ran down Igor's spine. Were they now the hunted? On August 8th, the production team had stopped work for the day and settled down in their cabin for the night. The cabin was full, and Michio opted to sleep outside in the tent. Igor advised him against it, knowing that the bear had already ventured into their camp and was unafraid of humans. But Michio insisted on staying in his tent. Not only did he prefer being closer to the great outdoors and having his own space, but he couldn't stand the sound of other people snoring. Being under canvas just yards from the cabin was a much better option for him and would ensure he'd get a decent night's sleep, or so he thought. The day had been long, and Michio quickly nodded off to sleep, warm in his sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of nature. But in the darkness outside, something stirred. It was a large grizzly bear that was prowling the surrounding woodland. It sniffed the air, the scent of the production team carried on the wind. It walked nearer, coming in for a closer look. Michio continued to sleep, unaware that his dreams were about to come crashing to an end. At 4 a.m., just before the milky haze of the dawn light, the bear sniffed outside Michio's tent. It snorted, and the vegetation under its heavy paws rustled the other side of the canvas. Its long snout was inches from Michio's face. He suddenly woke. The rustles, the deep-throated growling, and the loud sniffs had risen him from his slumber and had alerted him to the danger outside. He held his breath, listening and waiting. His mind was racing, and his heart began thundering in his chest. There was no way of alerting the others inside the cabin. All Michio could do was stay still and silent, hoping that the bear would lose interest and walk away. But the bear had other ideas. It had smelt something inside the tent, Michio himself. Suddenly, it slashed through the canvas with its front paws. There was nothing to protect Michio from the beast. It was in predatory mode, intent on securing its prey rapidly. Michio cried out in alarm and kicked at the face of the bear as it lunged through the canvas. His screams were heard by his colleagues in the cabin. Their guide, Igor, heard the commotion unfolding outside. It was 4 a.m. He opened the cabin door to see the back end of an enormous grizzly sticking out of Michio's tent. The bear was mauling the photographer, and Igor shouted, "Tent! Bear! Tent!" Everyone leapt out of their beds and ran outside. Michio was putting up a fight, but the bear bit down on him repeatedly, tearing flesh and biting into bone. He was powerless in the mighty beast's jaws. It shook its head from side to side, and Michio was thrown around like a rag doll. His colleagues were just 10 meters away. The tent had collapsed under the bear's weight, and underneath the canvas, Michio was grappling with the grizzly. Immediately, Igor grabbed a metal bucket and a spade. He ran towards the dilapidated tent and the ensuing attack, hitting the two items together. They crashed and banged in the night, the metal on metal ringing in their ears, but by the illumination of their flashlights, the bear didn't even flinch. Instead, It tugged and pulled at Michio, dragging him from his sleeping bag and into the dark, cold night. The others shouted at the animal, but it was in vain. It dragged Michio into the woodland and out of sight. His cries died down, and his friends knew that he had likely succumbed to his injuries, but in the darkness, they couldn't see anything. They had to wait until first light before they could track him down. They found his body in the woodland. It was a devastating finding and traumatic for those involved. The attack had happened so quickly and was thought to have been an exceedingly rare predatory attack. The noise from those who witnessed the attack and tried to intervene didn't deter the bear as it normally would. As news spread about the terrible incident, a photograph emerged on the internet and went viral. It was a disturbing image, and the caption claimed that it was the last photo Michio had taken on his camera. In the photo, an aggressive grizzly bear peers in through the open door of a tent. It's a terrifying image showing the bear's long canines and dominant stance, apparently seconds before it launched its attack on Michio. But it is, in fact, a fake. The lighting on the animal is different from that on the tent. Outside is broad daylight when the attack occurred at around 4 a.m. Although Russia's north does experience daylight nights, in August on the Kamchatka Peninsula, sunrise is between 5:30 and 6:30 in the morning. It was found that it was a Photoshop photograph which was entered into a competition called Worth 1000 Photoshop. It was entered under the category entitled Hoax Last Photo Taken Before Death. Those who knew Michio only had the nicest things to say about him. He was an incredibly humble and modest man. When meeting somebody new for the first time, he would ask them about their story and listen intently, rather than talking about himself. In 1992, he founded the Aurora Club, which gives youths in Japan the chance to experience Alaska. His hope was that it would enrich their lives just as it had for him. Now, 3 decades later, the club is still running, and Michio continues to inspire the younger generation, as his photos and written works are still used throughout Japan today, such as in school textbooks. Michio was missed by so many that 12 years after Michio's death, his life was commemorated at Halibut Point State Recreation Area, just north of Sitka. Woodcarver Tommy Joseph carved a totem pole out of a red cedar tree. Depicted in it was Michio at the bottom, holding his beloved camera, and above him were the animals he loved to photograph. A fitting tribute to an inspiring man who left this planet too soon after meeting his terrifying final affliction.